Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Eamon McAdam. So, over the last week, there's been some pretty horrific things happening in the coast of Syria, most notably massacres of Alawite communities. And I'm going to talk a lot about it in this episode and contextualize it within what's happening in Syria in general, because I think there is still a lot of confusion and a lot of really confused narratives going around, because I think people can't make heads or tails. It is definitely massacres that happened over the last week. I think the latest numbers are atrociously about 1,000 people, mostly civilians. And I'm going to talk about it because I think a lot of people are very sort of shocked and kind of confused. So that's going to be the subject of today's episode. Before I get into it, brief announcement. My new video essay is finally out. Where are the Arabs? After 4 months of work, after 2 months of delay, it's finally out. And it's on YouTube, and go watch it. It is an hour, 20 minutes of me with clips, obviously, from films, talking about Arab nationalism, talking about why Arab states are just so horrible, even when it comes to the thing they talk about endlessly, which is Palestine. Why does Sisi of Egypt talk endlessly about the Palestinian principles and Palestinian rights, but does nothing about it, does nothing to support Palestinians, and quite the opposite, is actually quite, collaborating with the Israelis? I track that history, and I track it basically starting with the 50s. But ultimately, I also connected with the present moment, and I try to do something which I have not seen anyone else do, which is try to do an actual class-based analysis in the Arab region. That's something, honestly, that Arabs are just not very good at. And I hesitate to say that, but I very rarely see good class analysis. And so, where are the Arabs? It's out now. Please go watch it. And if you watch it and you like it, please like it, subscribe to the channel, share it in your networks, leave a lengthy comment, and help me get it out there. I really appreciate it. And that is an example of, this is me a bit more spontaneous. Once a week, I talk about things. It's a bit more, natural. But those video essays and that one is the study, is me really sitting down and working and trying to come up with a thesis that's full and a bit unique, let's say. So that's the announcement for this week. So let's get into some headlines before we get into the main topic of today's episode, which is, Syria. So on March the 8th, 4 days ago, a Palestinian activist was kidnapped and detained in New York. His name is Mahmoud Khalil. He is a student activist, a master's student at Columbia, and he was one of the sort of main figures of the Columbia student encampments. I think he was the lead negotiator with the administration. And on March the 8th, he was just abducted by ICE agents, immigration, these essentially I don't know how to describe them, but they're sort of paralegal, detention officers. Anyway, they abducted him and reportedly took him to a detention facility in Louisiana, which is thousands of miles away. And it's horrible, it's condemnable, and it's just another one of these examples of how Trump is really, and his administration and ICE and all the people around him are really pushing the boundaries of authoritarianism in the United States. Because not only does he do this, or not only is Mahmoud Khalil still in this detention facility, but the statements that have been released afterwards, the White House briefing, whatever, on Twitter, wrote a post which is absolutely bonkers. It starts with Shalom Mahmoud. This is something that every single person, every single Jewish person, regardless of whatever they think, like, this is atrocious. Like, because, Trump is a fucking fascist. His main kind of like ally is a guy who did a Nazi salute, and Steve Bannon and the like of them are still doing it and whatever. But regardless, what they say in the statement as well is that this arrest is the first of many to come. And what they also say, when pushed against it or pushed about what is the crime that he's committed of doing, they say, well, he didn't commit a crime, but there's like a vibe. He was acting against U.S. interests. And apparently, the foreign secretary of the United States, Marco Rubio, whatever, he signed off on it. Like, the foreign minister should not have anything to do with this. But because it's about sort of like national interest, foreign interest, whatever. Anyway, it's fucked up. It's honestly something that I'm really glad people are like catching on to and like mobilizing against and like going down to the streets. Because this is like explicit fascism. Like the ability to abduct. Also, this person like is a green card holder, is like a permanent resident. His wife is an American citizen. And that doesn't matter, right? He's an undesirable, He is, to return to like the kind of like politics 101 lingo, an unperson. And so they have this ability to just remove this undesirable person. And, what is there is no real limit to what they can do. Or rather, they're very explicit about this. This is a kind of attempt to normalize, to experiment, to then be able to do this with other people and other, forms of non-citizen permanent residents, potentially even then citizens. No one is really safe. Noura شو اسمه عرقات, this Palestinian American lawyer, said something I thought was very powerful, that your silence will not protect you. Your silence is a target. Your silence is not a shield. And so, honestly, also there's this really fucked up thing. The Democrats as well, they cannot come out and condemn this. They cannot come out to say this is bad. Like, without saying, oh, this guy was horrible and he was doing horrible stuff on the Columbia campus. And so it's like, the reason that the Trump administration, that ICE, that the like, have picked Mahmoud Khalil is because they know that there's bipartisan support against Palestinians in order to basically normalize and push their fascist agenda to be able to abduct and get rid of undesirables. And undesirables is a term, is a category that can keep being expanded. It's really fucked up. Another thing that's really fucked up about this is because I have seen posts by some people who claim to be in support of Palestinians, whose whole personality, whose whole political image is in solidarity with Palestinians. Some whose names, like big accounts, their names is about Palestine, free Palestine, have been talking against this person, have been speaking out against Mahmoud Khalil, a Palestinian, because he is in support of the Syrian revolution. Mahmoud Khalil is a Palestinian Syrian. I think he was born in Syria. But regardless, that is atrocious. And that is just another example of how these people should not be centered, should not be platformed, because their solidarity is this thin. Because even if you're a Palestinian, if you have a wrong opinion, or if you speak out against something that they disagree with that goes against their narrative, you become an undesirable in their eyes as well. And I think there's no clearer example of this than when Assad fell, when he was overthrown, and people in Gaza were celebrating this fact. And these same people, these same pro-Palestine accounts were condemning the Palestinians of Gaza. In one instance, I won't name names, a Palestinian journalist was condemned to death by an account who her whole thing is Palestine and Palestinians because he supported whatever. This is a Palestinian journalist in Gaza, but he speaks out for the Syrian revolution. Then he becomes, then to him, or like to these accounts, he becomes, in the same way that the Israelis see him, an undesirable. It's so bonkers. And to me, it's more frustrating that these people are still platformed, that there is no accountability for the incredibly harmful narratives that they've been spreading and still continue to spread. So the second headline for today is this bizarre press conference that Trump held with Elon Musk, which, goes to show we live in such dangerous times, but also such cringe times. Like, it is so painful to watch this. And it's just so obvious, there's like no kind of political finesse or anything. This is straight up the President of the United States of America, like, doing an advertisement for a private company. Like, and not just doing an advertisement, like mentioning it, like reading off a list of things and being like, you can get pretty cheap cars from this place and they're really good. And he sits in one of the cars. Like, why? What is this? What's going on? Like, I understand, obviously, I've been following up. Like, I know Musk and Trump have had this relationship for the last few months, and Musk really did help Trump, like, become president. But, like, it's not just, technofascism. This is, like, just straight up, how do you describe it? Like, corrupt, like, oligarchy. And it was bizarre. It was bizarre. And the reason that this happened is because there have been protests in front of Tesla showrooms in response to Musk's, involvement in Doge, in this Department of Government Efficiency bullshit, which has been gutting the US government, which has been gutting, like, basic services. And, like, they have an eye towards Medicare and Social Security and all, like, the most basic things that keep the US government afloat, or essentially, like, the US population. Like, the US is notorious for, like, having no subsidies in the way that, like, European states do, like no universal healthcare or whatever, but these are the bare minimum, and they're trying to cut that. And so there have been protests in front of Tesla showrooms. Again, Tesla is a car manufacturer that, like, Musk is the CEO of. And they make these horrible cars that, like, explode by themselves and they look atrocious. And they now are a kind of symbol, or like it or not, at the moment, if you drive a Tesla, people are going to think you're a fascist. And there's this really sad thing, like, people are like, no, I bought it before he became whatever. Like, you better sell that Tesla. But yeah, on top of that, I think, also Trump then goes out and says, like, we will call any protests in front of or attacks on Tesla showrooms as domestic terrorism. This, again, is like a really important note to suggest that, like, we are still living in this time of the war on terror, and terror is intentionally a vague term that can encompass anything. And yeah, it's horrible. And it's condemnable. And I'm glad people are pushing back against it because, I don't know. A lot of stuff. Like, it's pretty obvious. It's very hard to talk at all clearly about this because it flies in the face of every basic democratic norm of, which, again, I understand the United States is not and never really has been in any true sense a democracy. But even in the standards of, like, bourgeois democracy, this is bonkers. And so, on top of that, I really hope that people get off of Twitter. I'm honestly kind of shocked how many people are still on Twitter. And if we believe that boycotting has an effect, like we do with Palestine, we have a very direct thing we can do with Twitter, which is to just get off of it en masse. And a lot of people have, but a lot of people are still on there. And again, Twitter is owned by Musk. And I think getting off of it can really help accelerate the sort of, like, sidelining or kind of, further pushing Musk into economic whatever. It's all a bit fanciful, but, it's something we can do. It's something in our hands. And it's not that bizarre because people have been migrating. I moved to Blue Sky like a year ago. It's been horrible. I don't like it. I'm trying to make it work. I'm trying to grow it into a space which is a bit more international. But yeah, stop posting on Twitter, please. For the love of God. It is run by an actual fascist who is now in the heart of the US government, in the US empire. And he has like a direct link to Donald Trump. And I do think being on there is functionally kind of like supporting him in a tiny, tiny way. So that's that. So let's get on to the main topic of today's episode, which is what is happening in Syria, what is actually happening in Syria, or headlined, the truth about what's happening in Syria. I'm very sorry for those that know this podcast. I think you can tell this isn't just clickbait. This is like intentionally subversive clickbait because I don't like it when people do those types of titles. Usually the people that do those titles don't actually know what the truth is because especially at the moment, the truth or like what's really happening is very difficult to pinpoint, I think anybody who is saying that they have access to the truth or what is happening in Syria and has like a neat package is a bullshit artist. Because, like, okay, I'll talk about the massacres that happened in the coast. And there, I think things have become a lot clearer in general. But in general, in Syria, in the last like 2-3 months, there have been seismic shifts. And there's just a lot of moving pieces, which I'm going to talk a lot about today. But so if anybody comes and says, this is what's happening, here's a neat narrative, it's all the Israelis plot to try to overthrow and like change this, anti-imperialist state and regime change and whatever, it's bullshit. It's absolutely bullshit. It does not fit with what is actually happening on the ground. And there are just so many different pieces that contradict that exact narrative. So just to kind of preface, I am not going to share the truth about Syria because I don't think anybody knows, not even Shara, not even the Israelis, not even the Americans, know the truth of what's happening in Syria because there is no one truth. There's a lot of moving pieces in this very large country that is experiencing massive seismic shifts and is in a pretty fucked neighborhood, so to say. So I'm going to go through it. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the massacres that happened over the last week. I believe starting March the 6th, there were reports of an insurgency by remnants of the Assad regime in what used to be like the heartland of support for the Assad regime. It's important to note here that Assad himself was Alawite. Right? And Alawites are a small, ethno-religious or just religious sect. Honestly, I find those things very confusing. Like, what constitutes an ethno-religious or just a religious thing? But regardless, it's a group of, the Alawites are kind of a break-off from Shia Islam. But regardless, he himself was Alawite, and his father sort of implemented for the first time, and the sort of like Baathists at the time in the late 60s, a kind of sectarianism in Syria. And so basically, as Alawites, they not only brought in more Alawites to the heads of the army, to heads of whatever government officials, members of the family, but also then categorized the rest of Syria based on sectarian components. Regardless, this is just background. This is not at all defense or justification for whatever, but just to state that this is the sort of history of the sectarianization of Syria. This is obviously tiny nutshell of all these things. But so this is why there is a perception of Alawites as being inherently supporters and allegiant to the Assad regime. And so Latakia and other areas in the coast were sort of like heartlands of not support, but because, in 2011 there were protests even in Latvia against Assad. And even in December, when they were overthrown, there were protests celebrating in Latvia. Regardless, some of these groups, some of these sort of like remnants of the Assad regime did do an insurgency, and there was a sort of pushback by the new interior ministry, which is still like a hodgepodge of like pretty horrendous groups, Islamists that have like kind of formed into the interior ministry. This quickly escalated into revenge killings, into sectarian killings, into massacres, and the numbers are horrific, the stories are horrific, the images are horrific. And it is very difficult to look too closely into it because it is very painful. Not just to see death and murder and bloodshed, but again in this sort of like Arab v. Arab way. And so that happened. Shara comes out and says, the president now, the self-elected president, that he condemns these, and he says that there will be accountability and people will be brought to justice, that no killing should take place and whatever. We have yet to see how that accountability mechanisms will materialize, but regardless, the groups that committed this massacre are in themselves also sectarian groups. And the massacres are honestly just atrocious. They're horrible. And there were protests in Damascus and other parts of the country against these killings, with the aim to be like, we are all Syrians. And that, this type of sectarian bloodshed is a thing of the past, is a thing of the Assad regime that we do not want to replicate. That this is exactly why we overthrew Assad. That the principles of the Syrian revolution dictate that this cannot happen. And basically, what's really important about noting that is that this signals, alongside other protests, alongside other statements by Syrian activists, a renewed civil society, right? Which was disallowed from manifesting under Assad, and which, since the overthrow of Assad, has been, returning and has been more vocal and has been organizing these protests. And there is a lot of hope in those movements to hold this new government to account. Because, again, we're not just talking about one-off killings or whatever. This is part of the ethos of some of these groups. Some of these, Islamist, hardcore, sectarian groups. That, There has been some tendencies to, like, once they're integrated into the interior ministry, to kind of, like, de-radicalize them in that way. Again, we have not yet seen that manifest. So, that is the, what I have to share. There's others. I'll put stuff in the show notes, like other kind of descriptions or analysis about the massacres on the coast. But aside from that, or at the exact same time, there is a context, because what's happening at the moment is that a lot of people have seized this opportunity. And I use those words very specifically, because I see a lot of schadenfreude, of almost joy. And this is very, very fucked up. It's very morbid. But I see a lot of people jumping on the discourse of this massacre and saying, aha, I told you so. I told you so. This is why we shouldn't have overthrown Assad. And again, these aren't Syrians that are saying this. I want to make a video later on, like as a standalone video, that, or rather, I'll just do it here. There is something very strange happening in discourses around Syria. In almost every other context, there is this knee-jerk tendency to center the voices of those most affected in anything we talk about. We talk about Palestine, we center Palestinians. We talk about the struggles of, black people in the US, we center black voices. Queer folk, we center queer folk. Why do we not do that with Syria? When we talk about Syria, when you look online, when you see the discourse, it is just every single other person except Syrians that are talking about whatever, that are being platformed and shared and whatever. Why? What? It does not make any sense to me. That literally any white guy, any rube off the street comes and says some stuff and will center their voice instead of centering a Syrian. And again, there is no one Syrian. Syria is a very large country with a lot of different ethnicities and religions and sects and opinions and political tendencies. And so it is this very bonkers thing that there's almost this like uniform narrative on Syria that is mostly propagated by non-Syrians, which totally strips Syrians of their agency, of, their own placement within this structure, their own knowledge and experience. And part of the reason we center voices of those most affected by the systems of domination that we're describing or we're talking against is because they understand it more than anybody. They live it every single day. It is not just they can plug in and out, like it is their fucking daily existence. It is their family. It is their WhatsApp group. It is their social media. But the reason is because what Syrians have to say contravenes certain narratives that people live by, that is the kind of mainstay of people's ideology and understanding of how the world works, which is just wrong. The world does not work this way. Syria is not simply a place where the US and Israel are controlling everything that's going on. I think that does a lot of harm and also gives the US and Israel a lot more credit than it's due. It makes them out to be these super overpowerful, the overthrow of Assad is not a US-Israeli plot. I don't understand how people are still on this thing. And I see this a lot. Because, and again, when people say this, there's a lot of suppositions, a lot of things in the background that they're not saying. So again, let's dissect. When people say that the US and Israel overthrew Assad and installed Sharia, that Sharia, formerly known as Jolani, is the US and Israelis' guy. So, why is that the case? Where is the evidence to suggest that? They present none. Maybe that there are a few groups who are aligned with HTS who have gotten medical treatment in Israel, or whatever. But there is no strong evidence to suggest this, Secondly, why would they want to do that? Well, because the assumption is that Assad was strong against Israel, and that the Israelis want to overthrow him because he is a thorn in their side. Why? Why? What has Assad done against Israel? For the 24 years that he was in power, he did not fire one single shot, even though the Israelis are occupying Syrian land. Even though in the last 5 years, the Israelis have been bombarding Damascus and Lat'iyah and different areas of Syria. Oh, because he provided a land route. Okay. I mean, Assad did not invent that. This existed way before Assad as well. Literally before the Ba'ath Party. And will probably continue to exist as a land route of whatever. But so, basically then the last bit, and this is the most frustrating bit, when people see this horrendous massacre and then say, aha, I told you so. Because Assad was defending minorities. Assad was the thing that was preventing minorities from being massacred, as we're seeing now. What the fuck are you talking about? How many hundreds of thousands of Syrians were killed? What protection to minorities? And then, so all these hundreds of thousands, people that were massacred in the Saidnaya prison, these were just, I don't know, sorry. It's honestly just so fucking frustrating to even delve into some of these ideologies, but it is so present. I see it just so matter of fact, even though people do not examine it this any further. And so basically when they say, I told you so what they're saying is Syrians should not have overthrown Assad. Syrians should have remained happy to live under this brutal, authoritarian, murderous butcher of a regime. Syrians should have been happy that, minorities were not protected under Assad. The Druze communities in the south were not protected under Assad. The Christians in Damascus, in Aleppo, the Armenians in Aleppo, like, you know what I mean? When you do barrel bombs do not identify majority and minority, but also, what the fuck? So it's okay for him to kill the majority, the Sunni populations? And so I find it deeply frustrating, and I've talked a lot about this on this podcast. But imagine a person, again, I won't name names, but if you know, you know, who says, "I told you so." Wherein literally 5 years ago, this same person was standing in front of Saidnaya prison, only 100 meters that way, taking a selfie and saying, "What a beautiful day," while on a propaganda tour hosted by the regime, by the Assad regime. And this same person is now still has clout. I think there needs to be so much accountability for these people. I've went off too much on tankies. You know how I feel about tankies. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Syria now. But just as a final note, what I have noticed is that the Israelis are openly talking against Sharia. And so, functionally, what you have at the moment is tankies who are self-described leftists are on the same page as the Israelis, as the Americans, when it comes to Syria and Ukraine. And I think that really has to be a moment of self-reflection. I don't think it will, because they have their own logic that's sort of like moving in a certain cycle. I think the best example of this is that Tulsi Gabbard, who is literally like the darling of the tankies, who ran for US president in 2016. She is now the director of the CIA under Trump. How is that not a wake-up moment? People are still quoting Tulsi Gabbard. She is the director of the CIA. But people cannot move on past the fact that, like, she is the darling of whatever. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about just things that are happening in Syria, just to give a sense of how many moving pieces there are and why these simplistic narratives are bullshit. That anyone who comes up to you and is presenting a neat package, who's coming up and saying, "This is the truth of what's happening in Syria," they're bullshit artists. So, only recently, the new government in Syria, like only a couple of days ago, signed an agreement with the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, largely a group of Kurdish forces in the northeast of the country, to essentially dissolve and become part of the Interior Ministry, to become part of like the security forces of the country. This is like a bit of a seismic shift, again, in itself. Apparently, there's been a similar agreement with militants in Swaida, to the south of the country, the Druze populations. All of this comes on the back of this shocking statement by Öcalan in the in Turkey, that essentially is calling for the PKK to lay down their arms. This obviously is like a slightly different context. We did a whole episode on this on the Fire These Times, if you want to listen more about that. But seeing as though the militants in the north of Syria, the Kurdish groups in Rojava, model a lot of their organizing around Öcalan's statements and ideology and like writings, I think those things have to be connected in some shape or form. If the PKK are calling to lay down their arms, then the SDF in Syria are sort of making these agreements with the new government. That has to be somehow related. And again, this is all very fresh, but like that already complicates the narrative a little bit. Also, because of the way that the US is moving and probably will want to pull out of Syria, the SDF were getting a lot of support from the Americans, especially in their fight against Daesh, against ISIS. So, And this, again, Turkey has a huge interest in what happens in Syria. Not only were they very aligned with HTS, who are now, heads of the new government, but they are also like the chief sponsors of a group called the SNA, the Syrian National Army, who are basically the Turkish militia that their whole thing is fighting Kurds, is massacring Kurds. And so is this now a shift from the side of Turkey to maintain their grip or maintain their control over these groups, but now have it integrated into the army? Or is it their attempt at now like wiping their hands of what the SNA have done? We don't know. It's complicated. Another thing that's happening is that Israel is occupying more territory in the south. They're bombing areas across Syria, including in Latakia, in the same areas that we were describing earlier where the massacres happened, only this last week, and in Damascus and in Daraa. And they're pushing for more occupation of Syria. And that's fucked. And again, it's just another sign that the Israelis are not happy with that they want to push for more occupation, that they're worried that Shara and this new government and this new sort of whatever that's forming is a threat or is a potential threat. And they're openly talking about wanting to demilitarize their border with Syria. I say border with quotation marks because it's all occupied land. What else is going on? I mean, fuck, the Iranians. Like, God knows what their calibrations are. At the moment, again, they were one of the most important players in Syria for the last 10 years. And after the fall of Assad, most of their fighters, most of their, in some cases, settlers, fled, left, went to Iraq, went back to Iran, went back to whatever. And so that's another huge factor that is very difficult to put into account because it's very hard to see what they're doing, what they're planning. It seems like they may be gunning for another, nuclear deal or some sort of they've been doing these rapprochements with Saudi. Saudi is another example of something that's like a burgeoning power. I mean, it's been burgeoning for a while, but now, why is the US, Ukraine, and Russia, why are they doing their negotiations in Saudi? What is happening there that's made Saudi this arbiter of negotiation? Why is it a neutral third place? It's not. But also just signals the fact that it is become kind of emboldened and has become a new regional power that always was a supporter of some of these radical Salafist groups in Syria. And so that's another factor that's not taken into account that again complicates this narrative or I guess people see that as part of the narrative, but again, it's not, because I don't know. My whole point of this episode is to suggest that what is happening in Syria is complicated. It's very, very complicated. And no one can really make sense of it all. Again, now with Trump himself signifies a seismic shift in US foreign policy, in the attitude of authoritarian leaders across the region. It's just also, I don't know, Russia is now also doing negotiations with the new Syrian government to maintain its ports in, again, the same region in the coast of Syria, playing a kind of pragmatic role there. There's talks that they might even give up Bashar al-Assad to be held, trial in Syria. They've been playing very pragmatically. What else is going on? Oh, there's this horrible re-emergence of persecution of Syrians in Lebanon, many of whom still cannot return to Syria, many of whom do not want to return to Syria. There is no obligation, you know what I mean? There's this Because, I mean, in many ways, their homes were destroyed, their livelihoods were destroyed. They've been in Lebanon for 10 years. They've built a life there. And so, with continuous pushbacks or forcible returns of Syrian refugees, or Syrian migrants, let's call them, in Lebanon, this is going to cause tensions with the new Syrian government, and I'm sure it already is. Obviously, there are tensions with Hezbollah, and there have been attacks like in the border region between Syria and Lebanon. God, honestly, I don't know if this is a useful episode, but because I think a lot of people want clarity. And the problem is, in a situation like this, there really is no clarity. There is too many moving pieces, and things are very fresh. And like literally something will come out today that'll completely subvert any narrative where it's like a neat package. And so just as we, find it really frustrating when some rube goes on the New York Times and says, this is what's happening in the Middle East and this is what's whatever. And it's complete bullshit. Or I don't know, some of these like pollsters who come out with confidence and say like Hillary Clinton is like 80% likely to win the US election of 2016 and then loses by, well, not a landslide, but loses. And what they do is they basically say, oh, actually, I was wrong because da 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 da. And they are still doing it. And people are still buying it as though they have some foresight or some legitimacy or some closer connection to the truth than any of us. But the truth is they don't know. Very few people do. And what we have to do is keep vigilant, keep our eyes on the ground, read many different sources. There is no one person, especially not some white dude who has been wrong on everything, who is literally just a propagandist, who is literally just a grifter, who is literally just out for clickbait, who does not give a shit about the lives and dignity and freedom of the people he is talking about, or that she is talking about. These are not people to be centering or platforming. And so, basically, what is happening in Syria? I don't know. A lot of shit. What is the truth? There is no one truth. There are a lot of things. There are a lot of players, a lot of factors, a lot of mutually exclusive interests, a lot of regional dynamics, a lot of internal dynamics, a lot of remnants from the 54-year-long reign of the Assad regime, which again only collapsed 4 months ago. But what is certain is that anybody who is telling you that they have access to the truth is a bullshit artist. And you should either ignore them or push back against them and, I don't know, call them out. Anyway, I think basically that's it. That is today's episode. Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you appreciated it. As always, or as I've been doing now with the new season, I'm going to do a live stream this Sunday where you can ask me anything. We can talk about whatever, the video essay, this episode, the episode before, and I'd love to see you all there. If you like this podcast as well, there's a tip jar below. Become a member of our Patreon, or just like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Leave a review or rating if you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcast. Really helps get this podcast out there. And so, yeah, stay safe and stay sane. I'll see you all next time.